Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of We Understood That Reference. Well, I've watched a lot of superhero movies and I know a lot about some superhero lore beyond the movies. I've never really gotten into comics. My co-host, on the other hand, loves comic books, so let's talk about comics. I'm Claiborne.
And I'm Nikhil.
As I've mentioned, I haven't really gotten into comics. I've seen some panels online, usually if I'm interested in knowing more about a particular character or a plot line from a movie or something, but I've never actually read a single comic.
Wow.
What would you say to someone like me about comics? Why should I read them and where should I even start?
You should totally read comics, especially if you love a character. This is something I find totally fascinating because there's some people out there who love comic book movies, get experience these characters, but not in the medium in which they were formed.
Mm-hmm.
So what was your first introduction to which was the first superhero that you liked?
I don't know. We talked a little bit about childhood superheroes, and I think it's just the kind of typical stuff from our childhood in terms of what was a cartoon during those times.
Okay.
But I think in particular, probably Batman was a big one because we grew up with the Tim Burton Batman movies, and then of course Batman Forever really came out right when we were, I think, at the sweet spot for it. So in terms of big screen superhero blockbuster type stuff, Batman really stood out. And then of course I was always a big fan of Batman Forever in particular, and the Riddler as well. So that was probably my favorite. Although when I was a kid, I watched some random. I didn't watch it religiously, so I don't really know specifically what it was. But I know I had seen some Justice League type stuff. I know I've seen some cartoons with Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman, Power Rangers, and some of those other kind of things, which probably don't come from comics as well here and there. Darkwing Duck, for instance, which I guess is more of a parody of a Batman type of comics. So I don't know. My childhood experience has mostly been from the random stuff on TV, and then probably mostly Batman in terms of movies.
Loving those Batman movies never compelled you to go out and read a Batman comic book?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I would wonder if I even knew it was a comic book character. I didn't grow up with comic books. I didn't really know what comic books were or anything like that. It never occurred to me anything about comic books. So I'm not sure if I would have made the connection of, this is Batman and he's specifically from a world of comic books and there's more to learn about him if I wanted. I do think that I read the novelization of the Batman Forever movie because I had as a kid I had a lot of kind of those random books that you can get at a Scholastic book fair or whatever, and there's a lot of just kind of random for kids stuff written.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that was one of them. So I read a lot of things like My Teacher is an Alien and Lewis Sacker's Wayside School and all of those things. And eventually I think the first Harry Potter book.
Yeah.
But the novelization of Batman Forever was one of those. And being a big fan at the time, I'm pretty sure I had the book. I probably read it. I just don't really remember because, it's been so long.
One of the things I find really interesting is that people always complain about something not being true to the source material. Everyone always complains about, these characters are changing. They don't feel like they're supposed to. But then so many of those people never actually experienced or read the source material. So
yeah, they don't know what the source material is.
Exactly.
The source material is Michael Keaton.
Yeah. So I sometimes I feel like everything's a carbon copy of a carbon copy. If you take a photocopy of something and you take a photocopy of that and take a photocopy of that photocopy, eventually what you're left with is very different than the original copy, Yeah,
and I think that's hard to pin down with Batman in particular because he's gone through so many iterations.
That's true.
In the movie world, as opposed to a lot of the other ones like Superman. There's really just the Christopher Reeve's Superman, and then the Brandon Routh or Routh or however you pronounce it, that everyone ignores and forgets about, and now the Man of Steel one. So there's only one or two to choose from. But even the Tim Burton run of Batmans, you went from two Michael Keatons to Val Kilmer to George Clooney, And then you've got the Nolan ones, and then you have Ben Affleck, and then you have upcoming now that Pattinson guy from the Twilight films. So it seems like Batman has really, ran the course there, and there are a lot of different takes and visions and directors and actors involved in interpreting this character. So it might be a little harder. Same thing with like Spider-Man. I think, he's been through a lot of iterations as well. So, but I don't see it as such a bad thing to. I think the argument of, it strayed from its source material is a weak argument anyway, because ultimately, I don't care about how true the Tim Burton Batman movie was to the source material. What I care about is, did I like that movie? Was it enjoyable?
Right.
And from what I understand about Batman 2, the source material, he's quite a bit different than where he's come now. He came out in, I guess, the Detective Comics series and wasn't really well fleshed out, probably. He was more like a, just kind of a random plot point here or something, like a story about Batman. And he was basically just, I guess, like a detective type of person who wore a bat suit for some reason. And I think he even had guns at some point, carried a gun with him.
Yeah.
So, the actual original Batman is probably very little to do with what actually became Batman in comics later on, once they decided, let's make this character a real thing.
See, that's the thing. That's the reason I love Marvel versus DC. I think that like the Marvel characters, for the most part, have like a history and like a through line, and like these characters have kind of evolved and grown over the years, whereas DC characters are more stagnant. Like there's like the origin story of who they are. These characters are established, and they've had like these big story arcs that like you can name like a few key stories that happen in their life, but like when you look at the Marvel characters, it's almost like they're real people who have like a history. You look at Spider-Man, he's gone to high school and college, and he's grown up, and so I've always been drawn towards like the history of the character, and that's why I love that there's like 600 back issues that have
and you see like an evolution there.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that might be something that's been a bit of a turnoff too, because if I ever do think about getting into comic books, there is like the trope of, it seems like Superman or Batman or even Captain America are always dying and then somehow managing to come back. Like I catch headlines about it usually throughout the years. It'll be like Marvel kills off Captain America. What comes next? And then eventually you hear he's back.
Right.
Same with Superman and all these characters. And so I get the impression that it's like the same basic story, which I already know from the movies and video games and other things, of like, Batman, he was a kid, his parents were murdered. Superman, his planet blows up, they send him to Earth.
Right.
He punches people, shoots lasers out his eyes. There's Lois Lane, she's a reporter, and that's it. That is the story. And so to me, it seems like the comics over the decades have mostly just been rehashing the same story with like new artwork and maybe slightly different details. But it doesn't strike me as something that would be more like reading Game of Thrones or something, where it's these characters that move on in a world, and the world changes, and the politics of the world change, and characters die, and characters marry, and politics change, and all of that. It seems like in the comic book world, things are a little more stagnant.
Well, I agree with you in DC, but I think that in Marvel, things do change, and characters do evolve, and characters are different now than they were 20 years ago, or the way that they're portrayed, and even the place they are in their life. But I also agree with you that like I think the companies kind of look at these things as like, oh, we want to attract new readers, and they say, oh, we want to simplify things so new readers can come on board and really hit the ground running and really enjoy our product. But for me, what I really loved about it was that there was this rich history. But I think that I think most people might agree with you that like that history is kind of daunting. Like, I'm not going to sit there and read 500 issues just to catch up with something.
Yeah, I think that's the other side of it, is it feels kind of inaccessible just in terms of the volume and in history that you've missed out on. Like it would be like trying to take up Pokemon trading cards these days. Who knows where Pokemon is now? Like, there's so many crazy new generations of Pokemon, and so like you would have a deck and you want to play against somebody, and it's like, can't I just have a Bulbasaur? Is he still a thing? And like, if you weren't, there from the beginning, you wouldn't have all of these other, kind of characters in your deck there to choose from. And so the same thing seems with like comic books, where it's like, there's just so much there. Where do I jump in at?
Yeah, and I think that the companies are kind of scared that it turns people off, but I don't know. I kind of disagree. I think that it's that history that kind of it gives it like weight. It gives it kind of meaning. Otherwise, you're just kind of reading these one-off stories. They don't really matter. But the history kind of makes those stories matter. Mm. So that's why I'm like a fan of things changing and evolving, and like stories kind of mattering, and you having to keep up with the story, even if it's complicated or daunting.
Yeah. So it's a trade-off, because on one hand, it's harder for new audiences to come to it if there is an evolution or a history that is important to follow.
All right.
But like, I guess, right now with Batman, like I know Batman, I'm familiar with it. I could probably pick up any issue of a Batman comic and read it, and it would be fine. Like I don't feel like I would be missing out, because I know enough of the backstory and the kind of like character motivations and things like that. And I think the same would be true of most, most superhero comics that are kind of mainstream that I know from other media. So like maybe Fantastic Four. I don't really know that one as much. So who knows if I picked up that. I'm not sure what they typically do. All I know is that there's been some terrible movies made, and I get that there's 4 of them, and I kind of know their powers. But even in those movies, it seems, especially the latest one where they were like kids and. Or something. I don't know. Like it didn't seem clear just going off of the movies and a couple of video games that I've played related to Fantastic Four. It's not clear to me really who these characters are, and so I feel like that one might be tough if I were to just pull out a random comic. But even then, I'm sure there's be an origin story or a starter comic that I could begin with.
Right. I mean, it kind of should be like a soap opera where you can just walk in and like if you read 1 or 2 issues, like you'll kind of pick up what's going on. But then at the same time, if you've been a fan for like 10 years, there's like a secondary layer of a story that is more important to you, or like that you get. Yeah. So it should be able to work on both levels.
Yeah, but. Do you see a big advantage in terms of comics versus movies, or other things? Like for me, video games I think are kind of the same purpose, or maybe even a better way of doing it, because you're there playing as the character, or playing alongside these characters, and you really flesh out a lot of that lore through doing that, and it's a lot more engaging than like a comic where you're not really part of the action, you're not controlling anything. Right. And even in terms of movies versus comics, I don't see a big advantage for comics, just because you still have to read it, whereas a movie you can have the dialogue and you can have it spoken to you, and it's just a much more richer experience because of that. And then the visual side of comics, which I would think would be the appeal of comics, it being sort of advantage over like books, because you read a book, everything's just imagined in your head, and you don't have this awesome artwork to look at. But a movie is also a visual medium with moving images versus the static images on the page. So even though a lot of the comic artwork looks pretty cool, a movie is just so much more immersive.
Right, but like those, like they're supposed to be adaptations, like the TV, the video games, the movies. They're supposed to be like adaptations of the source material, which is the comic books. But the thing is, those products have so much so much wider reach. Like a movie reaches like millions and millions of people, whereas a comic book maybe you'll get a few 100,000 people to read that. So at some point it becomes like, which one's the horse and which one's the carriage? Because I guarantee you more people have seen Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man than have ever picked up a comic book, an Iron Man comic book.
Yeah.
So like for them, Robert Downey Jr. is the definitive Iron Man, and they don't even know what the source material is or is supposed to be. I don't even know actually, and I think that kind of makes it a more enjoyable experience to an extent, because I think the only character that I know from the comic books in depth is Spider-Man, and I don't really enjoy the MCU Spider-Man movies that much, and I think it's because I know too much. Oh, so like, what do you think if like the comic books went away? Like all these publishers are being bought by media conglomerates, and they're looking at the bottom line and they're saying, a TV show makes X millions of dollars, a movie makes billions of dollars, and the comic book industry is bringing in
Yeah.
a very small fraction of what these characters are doing in other mediums. So what happens if like comics completely go away? Because right now the stories that you're enjoying in other mediums, like in movies and TV, kind of got tested first in comic books. Like you're kind of picking and choosing like the cream of the crop. Like you have 40 years of comic books, and you're picking like the best stories and you're putting them to screen, and you're loving them, and that's why.
Yeah, like Thor.
Yeah,
that's the cream of the crop there.
I finished watching Thor: The Dark World last night, by the way.
Oh yeah, we'll have to do an episode on that to catch me up on what happened, because I don't really remember much of it.
Yeah,
but I get what you're saying. I think it's probably a financial mistake. Like I know DC recently has had a lot of layoffs, and the comic industry is probably struggling a bit, despite the huge box offices of these comic book movies. But content is always going to be necessary, and I think the advantage really of comics and just kind of written material in general is that it allows you to sort of finish a storyline. And I think a lot of the problems we see in movies and TV shows that sort of fail or jump the shark or something is that they don't know where they're going. You look at like Lost, which had it was a huge successful TV show, but the ending was kind of faulty there. And then same with Game of Thrones, where Game of Thrones was an amazing phenomenon, and then the last couple seasons just absolutely hated, and people just hated those, and it's because the source material didn't have an ending yet, and they diverged a lot from the source material in order to get to where they ultimately had gotten. And so the benefit, I think, of it is really in having this kind of a constant well of new intellectual property that is not only started but eventually gets finished, so the full story, and then you can adapt that to a movie or a television show, and it's going to be so much better. Usually, I mean, there's no reason you can't create a movie or a TV show and have it be wonderful, but more often than not you probably end up with something like the last Star Wars trilogy, where they don't know where they're going, and they're just sort of trying to make it up as they go. Whereas if in the last 20 years between the trilogies, if somebody was working on, and I imagine they probably did because there's a whole expanded universe or whatever that got scrapped, but there were probably completed stories there. If somebody was working on, hey, what happened after episode 6, let's figure that out, then they would have a complete story that would have a beginning, middle, and an end, and these important through lines to follow, and then that would be much easier to adapt in a sensible way versus creating something entirely new. And even if Disney took it over and they decided we don't like any of the expanded universe, we do want to make something new, if they could if they could invest the time first in writing a book or even a comic, whatever it might be, at least write a story, even if they don't publish it, if it makes no money, nobody else sees it, just for the sake of actually having a completed story. I think that's probably more important. And even if your comics aren't making any money, that doesn't matter. Like I said, don't even show it to people if you don't want to. The value is really in having that completed story at the end of the day, and the trademarked and copywritten characters and storylines and all of that, so that you can put it into a movie or a TV show, these more profitable mediums.
That's true. But I think that they should show them. I think that Disney made a mistake with that. What's it called? The expanded universe.
Yeah.
Kind of ignoring that. Instead of, they should have picked and chose what was the most popular.
Yeah, I hear that they might do that with some of the Old Republic stuff, because those video games have been really popular. The Knights of the Old Republic, and there's a current MMO that's been running for a while now called the Old Republic. And so even though that's been scrapped because of them scrapping basically everything outside of the movies. I've heard rumors that certain elements have been kind of incorporated into the movies or referenced or something like that, so it might still be canon, and that might mean that eventually they'll set a new trilogy or a movie saga or something in that time period.
Yeah.
And they probably will pull from a lot of the successful stuff. They'll still change it, and that's perfectly fine too. I imagine there's no reason just because something is canon doesn't mean that you can't change it. I'm sure, in the MCU, there's probably been lots of changes from how things were originally in the comics. But what you do is you pick the things that are working, and at least then it gives you, a through line to follow as well, and an ending that you're working toward, versus just taking some random characters and making stuff up as you go.
That's true. Yeah, having like a product that works and it's much better than being faithful to the source material. And I think that like picking and choosing like the best elements is the best way to go, or even like a loose adaptation.
Yeah, and see, even though I'm not like a comic fan, like I don't read the comics, I probably will never read comics. I still think DC and Marvel should make comics, because I feel like that stuff will push through to having better movies down the road.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It might take a long time to pay off. Like you might need 10, 20 years of comics that people are writing in order for you to get a good plot that you want to adapt into a movie. But it's still worth that investment to me, it seems like. So even though I wouldn't actually read the comics as they're coming out, I feel like ultimately I'll benefit from that work. And so I would hope that they would keep the comics going.
But what about the angry fans who later complain it's not faithful to source material? If you take away the source material, then they can't be mad.
Yeah. Well, like you said, that's 100,000 people versus the millions that watch the movie. So I think ultimately you don't have to care too much about the hardcore comic fans. And to be fair, like the people that are angry are going to be a small percentage of that already small percentage anyway. So it's not a big powerful group.
They're the loudest though.
So I know
they're the people you hear on the internet.
That's why you need a volume knob.
They're the people who comment on message boards and
but I mean, I think the thing is we're not taking anything away from them. Disney's not taking anything away from them by making a movie that's not true to the source material, because they still have the comics. If they are comic fans and that's what they like, they still have that.
Right.
So just like Game of Thrones, like I hate the whole Game of Thrones TV show now just because of how it ended. Like I would not encourage anyone to watch it, unless maybe I would say watch the first season and then just stop, just because the first season is really good television. But then from then on, don't bother, because you're going to get sucked into something that is just not going anywhere good.
Wow.
But it doesn't matter. Like, yes, I would have loved to have had a better TV show, but the books still exist and will hopefully be finished, and that is going to be the more enjoyable experience anyway. So I think the same would be with comics, is that it doesn't matter if you don't like Ben Affleck Batman. You still have a Batman that you do like, that you can go and read anytime you want, and would hopefully be continually produced by DC. I wouldn't want them to close up shop, and I can see comic book fans being mad if that were to happen. If they were to say, we're not going to bother with writing any new comics anymore, and it's all about movies and TV and video games, then that would be a bummer. And I do think that would shoot them in the foot creatively, so they shouldn't do that.
Right.
But you don't have to watch the movies. You have comics.
But with like Ben Affleck's Batman, like everyone was complaining about he used guns, like he killed people. Like that's not what Batman would do in the source material. You take away the source material.
Did Ben Affleck kill people?
Yeah,
I don't really remember. I don't remember him doing much other than just kind of midlife crisis
and saying Martha,
sitting around. Yeah, he just seemed like he was just a depressed old man, right? Like he. I would like to know more about the Ben Affleck Batman, just because I want to. It seemed like we kind of got into that in the middle, or really towards the end of his career, where I think traditionally Batman, starts off with Batman Begins. Tim Burton Batman starts with his origin and really his like first night out kind of thing.
Oh, right.
So you're used to getting introduced to Batman from the beginning, from the early stages of him becoming Batman, or just recently become Batman.
Yeah.
And Ben Affleck's Batman, it was sort of like we were just thrown into his near retirement. And It's interesting because we don't know anything about that Batman, because all we're seeing is the end of it. Like we don't know if he was a good Batman. We don't know how he was putting people away, putting criminals away in Arkham Asylum and all of that. We don't know anything about him. So, we missed the entire career of Batman. And I don't really know how they're going to handle that moving forward, but that's how it feels with Ben Affleck. I don't know if that was the intent or not, but for whatever reason, he just seems old and pretty much retired at the start, which seems like an odd choice.
Yeah. Well, then I guess you'll really like the next one, because I think the next one's supposed to be set in like his early days, or maybe like a year into his career.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind the retirement Batman. I just feel like there's greater problems with the whole Man of Steel saga of the DC era of movies. So I think that's the bigger problem there, and I think Superman is probably a much bigger problem in general than Batman, because I think Batman seemed a little more on the mark. At least, it's fine if he's dark and brooding. The other thing that I didn't really like was, he's a superhero technically, but all we've seen of Batman really is him fighting Superman, and that's weird because it's just a hero fighting another hero, and that sort of makes him a villain, really.
Right.
So I would like to see Batman's past, I guess, but at the same time, I don't mind seeing the retirement Batman. I just think that it would have been nice to have had that dealt with in a better way, essentially, so that don't ruin it with the whole Superman angle yet. Like, I like the Wonder Woman part of it, like the idea of him, he's kind of in retirement and he's like, I'm getting too old for this. I can't be doing this all on my own forever, and him wanting to create this like council of superheroes. That's the nice motivation, and it seems all fine. Just the whole Batman versus Superman stuff just didn't really work for me.
Yeah, they probably should have like built up to it a little bit more.
Yeah. So does he ever retire in the comics?
So there's like I don't think so. No, I don't think so. But there's like the Batman Beyond, where it takes place like in like 2050, and he's retired at that point because he's like old.
Yeah. Is he fulfilling like an Alfred type role to the new Batman?
Yeah, he kind of like takes over, and he kind of like mentors him, and
yeah, but he's not like a butler.
Not a butler, but he's the guy in the chair.
Okay. I feel like you should have to become a butler. I would like that to be the lore of Batman, is that it's just this weird superhero role that's like handed down generation after generation, and you find out that Alfred was the previous Batman.
That would be cool.
And you're just like constantly training your other person, but once the other person takes over, then you have to do dishes and laundry, and you're the butler now.
That's an interesting take.
Yeah. That's my version of the Batman.
I kind of feel like all of the Batman movies that we've gotten so far, or at least in the last 20 years, are kind of based on two comic book storylines. There's the Dark Knight Returns and Batman: The Long Halloween, and like those are the two most popular books out there, and they've used it as adaptations for The Dark Knight and Batman v Superman have taken elements from both of those books, and also a little bit Dark Knight Rises as well.
Yeah, is it more like origin related?
No, it's like the whole thing with like the Falcone family in The Dark Knight, that's pulled from The Long Halloween. You have the Batman versus Superman like fighting dynamic that was pulled from The Dark Knight Returns, and then in The Dark Knight Rises, remember he like kind of retires and kind of comes out of retirement.
Yeah,
that's pulled directly from The Dark Knight Returns. It's like kind of like an older, grizzled Batman coming out of retirement for another fight.
So, what superhero movie so far would you say has strayed the most from the source material?
Oh, see, that's another great point, because I think those are the ones that like everyone hates the most. Like the latest Josh Trank Fantastic Four, I would think. What else? I'm not sure. But but actually, when you think about it, there are movies that people love and people hate that are close to the source material. Like the first Fantastic Four from like 2004 or 2005, that was very close to the source material, and everyone hated it. So you never know.
That was the one with Captain America?
Yes.
Yeah, because that's the one I remember mostly, and it felt very, staying on track in a way, even though I didn't know the source material, but just from how it was put together, it felt like they know who these characters are, and they're, being consistent, more or less.
Yeah.
I think the one that was confusing though was the Silver Surfer, and that one felt like they almost grabbed something like some other property and just kind of threw it into the Fantastic Four universe. Which I guess, it's Marvel. I'm sure all of these people interact at some point with each other or not. I don't know if Silver Surfer is specific to Fantastic Four or what, but it just felt strange and didn't feel like part of everything there. And in terms of, I guess it was Galactus or something like that didn't make any sense. And so it felt like, well, maybe that was something that was more inspired by the original source than it was like, a good adaptation. But I don't really know. It's just, that's the feeling of it, because it feels a little disconnected and not as well thought out. Even though the first movie wasn't great, at least, it felt like they knew what they were doing. And I would attribute that to probably having source material to follow.
In the first movie, like the Doctor Doom the character is very different than he is in the source material. And I think that's might be one of the reasons people kind of hated that movie. But and same thing with Galactus. Galactus is supposed to be like a person or like a giant, and in the movie he's kind of like a cloud.
Yeah, well, clouds are scary.
They are very scary.
You never know when they might eat your planet.
Yeah, it keeps me up at night.
So do you have a favorite comic book storyline? I guess probably of the Spider-Man one, since that's what you read mostly.
That's a great question. I liked so let's see, what's a good one? Like the whole arc with Green Goblin and Gwen Stacy is a classic, and I think that's like one of the best ones. Yeah, and they kind of did it loosely in the very first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, even without the Gwen Stacy character. They still did that story.
They just took some of her points and put it into the film.
Yeah, well, so the Mary Jane in the Sam Raimi movies is like a mashup between Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy. Like those two characters kind of got molded into one and thrown in the movie as Mary Jane.
Since I don't read comics, I don't know a lot about comics. How long are they? Like if I were to read a comic, what am I getting into?
Like maybe half an hour. I think you could polish one off in 30 minutes.
And it would be like an actual kind of little booklet.
Yeah.
It's like more like a magazine or something, I guess.
Yeah.
Kind of magazine size.
Exactly.
Because I've seen them. I've gone to comic book stores. I've flipped through them. It seems like there's a lot of variety. Yeah. But I imagine there's some kind of like standard. Like this is your standard kind of normal comic book size and length. And so you'd have like a 30-minute read. It would be all one continuous story, or is it like little mini stories?
So it's changed a little bit. Like if you read a lot of the older issues, I would say before 1985, they're a lot more dense. So they might take a little bit longer. There's more text. And then the more recent stuff is definitely more art. You can probably get through it a lot quicker. And anything from like the last 20 years probably is part of a story arc. So it'll probably be either 6 issues or 12 issues. They started making graphic novels around 20 years ago, and that's been really profitable for them. So they'll have like a 12-part, series, and then they'll sell you the whole thing as a graphic novel.
So there is like a technical difference between a comic book and a graphic novel?
Yes, there is.
And so like a graphic novel is kind of a collection of comic books, or?
Yeah, exactly. So like there'll be 6 issues or 12 issues or 10 issues, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And a complete story, whereas, each issue will be one part of a story.
Yeah. And how much has the internet changed things? Like I said, I've seen some panels, some comic book panels, and most of that has been, I haven't purchased a comic book. I just go online and look for it, basically. Like I search for The Killing Joke, and I look at a few of the pages of that to understand, what's everybody talking about.
Okay.
So I can know what's going on. And I imagine you can probably pirate PDFs or something if you want it as well. Are comics even maybe released digitally? I know I've gotten some download comic like bonuses as like certain content stuff or signups. I've never really used it, but apparently some comics are digital. Is that changing the way people are consuming their comics?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is for me. Like there was a period where I didn't read a book in a long time, and then during quarantine I've started again with this Marvel Unlimited. You can read digital comics for it's like a monthly fee or an annual fee. It's kind of like a subscription. and then they have all the old issues, and before I didn't really like reading on a screen, but I've gotten used to it, and I actually prefer it now.
Yeah, I would think that if you had like a Kindle or an e-reader or something, it might be optimized for it in a way that could work well.
It is.
Versus like staring at your computer.
It's optimized for like iPads.
Yeah, like an iPad would work like a tablet would seem fine. And plus, then I would wonder, you could make it interactive as well. And I don't know if people are doing that or not, but the whole thing about comic books is that they're a static image, but in theory you could have it be a moving image still on the page. It could be like an animated GIF kind of thing, which I've seen done before with more standard like comic strips. You can look at online and see people do comic this kind of stuff that you might find in a newspaper, like a comic strip, but it's an animated GIF, so part of it is actually moving. And other things, obviously you click to turn the page, but you might have things that you could click to reveal dialogue or click to reveal more of the scene in a way that you can't do in a book.
Yeah, so they have like motion comics, but that's I think a little different. And in the Marvel Unlimited, like you can read like panel by panel. So sometimes when you're flipping pages, you kind of spoil like the big surprise, because once you turn the page, it's like it's right there. But with the panel by panel,
that's why another reason I never really got into it was just it seems like impossible to spoil it, because like things are eye catching, and it's like. I see, Superman shot through the head in the last panel there, and I can't like avoid it.
Right. Exactly.
It's there. I want to see what happened. I'm not going to, go up to the top left and read my way down there. I want to see why is he getting shot in the head?
Right.
So that kind of thing seems like it would be a problem.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty cool new addition. Although I feel like they're really optimized for iPads, because I've been reading a lot on my computer, so like once I'm all on my phone, and it's kind of weird. Like it's either zoomed in too much or not zoomed in enough. But I think that's because I'm not looking at it on an iPad, which is I think what it's kind of designed for.
Yeah. So how did you get into comics originally?
So I think my first foray was in so I was a big fan of the Spider-Man animated series in the 90s. And when that ended, that's when I started reading comic books. That's what did it.
Yeah. So how old were you?
I was 12, I think, or 13.
So it was sort of like you didn't go into comics for comics. You had already known of Spider-Man, and it was really about. So that's probably how it happens a lot now anyway, because like movies and TV are more common and popular,
right.
And so people are probably being drawn in that way. But I guess people do get drawn in just for the sake of comics. Probably especially if you're reading like Spider-Man or something because you like the movies, but then you find out you really like the medium of comic books, then you probably do start browsing comic book stores and checking out other things. And obviously we talk a lot about the superhero ones, but I imagine there are a lot of popular non-superhero comics as well, right?
There are, yeah. So what happened was like you've heard like Image Comics and Vertigo. It's where comic creators can go and work for these companies, and they own like the things that they create. Like if you work for a Marvel or a DC and you create a new character and it becomes really popular and gets made into a movie, you don't get any of that money. But if with Image or Vertigo, if you work for these imprints or these companies, if you create a character that goes on to be popular, you actually own that character. So there are a lot of lesser known characters with those properties. I think The Walking Dead is one of them, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think if I got into comics, I would probably not bother with DC or Marvel, and I would probably pick something that seems a little more independent, or just something that's maybe newer as well, just because then I don't have to worry about the history of it. I can already kind of start and follow along as it's coming out.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And I think that would probably be more enjoyable than having to go into something that already has like a lot of baggage that I'm not aware of or part of yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I don't know if I probably would prefer the non-superhero stuff as well. Like I watched The Walking Dead. I don't know that I really like it, but I don't know that I would follow the comics just because it's probably very kind of gruesome, and I don't really care for that as much.
Yeah.
but I don't know. I imagine there would be stuff, some interesting things. I think part of it is probably the illustrations, right? That's like the big selling point of comics. Obviously, the storylines are there and they're important. Not to downplay the importance of the writer, but I think it being a very visual medium, something that really stands out. Are those visuals, those illustrations. Do you have any particular like favorite artist or someone that has really stood out in that regard?
Oh, favorite artist. That's a good question. I like Todd McFarlane. He's pretty good. And I like John Romita. Like John Romita is like good classic, and Todd McFarlane's a little bit more not really current. He's more 90s, but still.
Yeah, you like that side of it too. Like when you're reading a comic and there's just a really striking image. Does that help kind of draw you in?
Yeah. Like if you read any of like Todd McFarlane's books, it's mostly just image. Like the images really tell the story versus a lot of the other creators where there's a lot of text, and that kind of drives the story.
Yeah. Is it pricey? How much do comics cost?
So when I was reading, they used to be about $2, $2.50.
Yeah.
They started going up to $3. Now I think they're like $4 or $5 each. That's why I think the digital comics have really taken off, is because you can get these subscriptions and then
you have access to like a whole library.
Exactly. Yeah. They come out I think like 6 months later,
Yeah.
so you're a little bit behind, but it's much cheaper. Like I think it's like $10 a month unless you have some sort of coupon. Like I did an annual, and it was like $60 for a whole year. That's like $5 a month.
What would you recommend to people then if they're like me, they haven't gotten into comics? How would we go about getting into comics? Where would be a good place to start?
Maybe like your local comic book store, or if you're interested in like Marvel, or there's the Marvel Unlimited, where you can do a 1 week trial for free, or Comixology, which has everything. Actually, that's probably a great recommendation for you. Comixology, you can get a week for free, and then I think it's like $6.99 or $5.99 a month. And it's the same thing. You have access to like all sorts of back issues, and that's not just Marvel. It's everybody.
Yeah. So then you can just kind of go through it and see what works for you and what your particular tastes are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Whether you're into Spider-Man or Batman or one of the other many mans.
Yeah. So like try it out, and then it's if you think about it, it's like $6 a month, and if you read 3 issues, you got your money worth.
Yeah.
Because I think online they sell for about $1.99 each, at least the older issues. I'm not really sure about the newer ones. The digital comics are are great for the companies too, because they they save so much on overhead.
Yeah.
They don't have to print, distribute, ship.
They don't have to do any work.
Yeah. So hopefully they pass that on to you, and they're a lot cheaper.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to be reading any comic books or not in the future. I'm sure I'm going to keep watching the movies, though. But if any of our listeners have recommendations, we'd like to hear your favorite comics, storylines, characters, artists, whatever it might be. Just tell us what you love about comics, and give us some recommendations as well. You can tweet at us or find us on Facebook at WUTR Podcast.
Awesome. See you next week.